Thank you, Tom, for that introduction and welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelist in just 5 seconds. But before I do, Tom said at the top that the United States remains the most powerful country in the world. And this may be indeed one area of contestation that I and my panelists might want to dig into. If you take a very conventional sense of power, as the often very conventional international relations theorists would have it, power is about having A do to B what B would otherwise not do. And if the United States is in a position to have that kind of power, when we think of empirical cases, like, for example, Ukraine or Gaza, it would be an interesting point of reference for thinking about what the US may be able to do post this 2024 election. So with that quick prolegomenon, I'm going to introduce immediately to my left Verónica Gago, who I had the great pleasure to hang out with in Buenos Aires just a few months ago. Verónica is the professor of social sciences at the University of Buenos Aires and the National University of San Martín. She's a political theorist and an activist, thus an engagé, working on issues of feminism and the global political economy, with her most recent books being a feminist reading of Debt, Feminist International, and Neoliberalism from Below, Popular Pragmatics and Baroque Economics. She's been a leader in Argentina's hashtag Ni Una Menos, not one woman less, I suppose not one woman fewer, but nevertheless, movement as a theorist and an activist. Verónica, always a great pleasure. To her left, Mohsin Hamid, who I also had the pleasure of hanging out with a few months ago in another part of the globe, is a British Pakistani author known for creative fiction and commentary examining contemporary global issues. Recent novels by Mohsin include The Last White Man and Exit West, which received the 2017 LA Times Book Prize for Fiction. His book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, was made, of course, into a film and shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Mohsin's engagement with themes of political turmoil, cultural displacement, and shifting individual and collective identities informs his essays on contemporary affairs in outlets like The Guardian, The New York Times, and the Paris Review. To Mohsin's left is Ece Temelkuran, who, in fact, I just met a few hours ago. We had lunch together. She's a Turkish novelist, a political thinker, and an analyst of the erosion of democracy and the challenge of populism on a global scale. Ece is the author of Together, 10 Choices for a Better Now, as well as the celebrated How to Lose a Country, the 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. Her novels are published in multiple languages, a frequent contributor as well to The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, elsewhere, and was the recipient of the PEN Translates Award and the Freedom of Thought Award from the Human Rights Association of Turkey, not an oxymoron. And in 2023, she received the El Mundo Award for her corpus of work. Ece, great to see you. And finally, Ben Rhodes, a writer, a political commentator, national security analyst, author of the New York Times bestsellers, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made and the World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. Ben's currently a contributor for MSNBC News and co-host of the podcast Pod Saves the World, a senior advisor to the 45th president and chair of National Security Action. Ben has also published widely in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. Ben, welcome. To begin, there's a customary distinction that people know of that comes from David Hume between the is and the ought. What actually is, what are the facts on the ground, and what can be a more normative, hopeful look at the world and its future. And I'd like to begin with the ought and move to the is when we're thinking about the US post-2024. What would be our ideal US in its relationship to the world beyond it come 2025? What would that look like in an ideal, typical way? Not your best sense of what it will look like, whether there's an administration under Donald J. Trump or the current president, Joseph Biden, but what could and should and normatively might it look like in an ideal way? And I'd like to begin with Ece and ask her to think for a bit aspirationally as to what an ideal type United States in its relationship to the world could look like.
Is too dark to think about, so aspirational is better. Hello everyone, welcome, and thank you for sharing this afternoon with us. I came to Washington 2 days ago, and since then I'm watching CNN and several other news networks. And I thought, you know, you have all these medicine advertisements. And I thought America, if it was a musical, it would be called Drugstore. And then also there are these, insurance company advertisements. You know, when you look at the market, what sells tells a lot about a country. So I thought, oh my God, there are so many fears. And even I had new fears, thank you very much. Like, you know, now I know that I have several illnesses as well, thanks to these advertisements. So, you know, rest of the world envies Americans for their lightheartedness and for their this spotless sunshine, eternal sunshine of a spotless mind kind of being. But then America, you know, since 2 days I'm thinking that, has too many fears. And now thanks to Trump, they know what it feels like to be represented by the worst of you. And the shame that we suffered in Global South is now familiar to Americans. Before Trump, it was impossible to tell the West, before Brexit, it was impossible to tell the Westerners from our part of the world that how devastating it is to be represented by the worst of you and to be known through these guys. So shame and fear, these are the two things that I have been thinking about. But also, coming to your question, I was thinking about this, you know, not very well-known story from like 5-6 decades ago about United States. My mother is a painter and my father is a lawyer. And they met through politics once, and my mother was in prison because she was a former Maoist, and my father, being a young lawyer, he actually rescued her from the prison. And before she even stepped out, he proposed, and then she said yes, and therefore I am. And one day she told me this story about Americans. I come from an anti-imperialist, anti-American family, as you can imagine, from the political CV of my family. But then she told me this story, which one day I'm going to write a novel about. She told about this American teacher that came to Turkey, in a very small town, by the way, who came through Peace Corps. And this young man taught them how to ask questions, how to question things. And then years later, she saw that all the class members that, you know, was taught by this young American guy became progressive leaders of the political movement. So when I am asked about US's role, I want to think about what is American people's role can be. Pankaj and Tom curated a very interesting, bunch of fellows. I think I wouldn't be too wrong to say that we are mostly people who are invited to international meetings as, you know, interesting people, controversial people, and then big guys go to the big room and talk about security stuff, real problems, and so on and so forth. But then this is the main stage now. So, and our view of the world, if I can say that, should be the mainstream in this whole conference. So I can say that maybe we should think about not US's role, but your role, American people's role. And that role can be truthful to the promises of this country. Promises that have failed, big time, but promises who are still remembered by some. And that promise was to have a dream. And American people, as opposed to US, didn't fail us that much, actually. Now I'm thinking. There was Occupy, there was Black Lives Matter, and now there's Columbia University and Yale University doing things for Gaza. So Americans' people's role, if I'm not too optimistic, might be as important as US's role in the world. And I'm looking forward to that as well.
So Ece, let's stay on that, and maybe if we can move to Mohsin for a second. So Ece looks at a positive American role in the future using examples like the Movement for Black Lives or Occupy, or what's happening as we speak in universities like Columbia and Yale. To what extent, Mohsin, do you see the power of American citizens and American activism allowing for, again, in a best case future between America and the world, as something that's affirming, something that you feel can take us into a more better, if not radiant future? And to what extent do you think the role of the state still is going to play a predominant role in how we think about a better America in the world?
So I think my relationship to America began when I was 3, and I came in 1974 and lived in California. And when I went back to Pakistan in 1980, I was 9 years old, and I thought of myself as a little American kid. I'd forgotten Urdu. And so I had to learn to be Pakistani again. And I've always had this kind of half-in, half-out relationship with America. I remember my dad's best friend in his grad school days in the 70s was a guy called Blake. And Blake had volunteered to serve in the US Army in the, I think it must have been the late 60s, when the Vietnam War was at its height. And he never got sent to Vietnam, but he volunteered at that time. And when he finished his service, he came back to campus. He told me he was very upset with, the anti-war protesters. Later, he came to understand that they actually had a very good point. And I remember when Blake picked me up, I was giving a lecture at Stanford, must have been the latter part of the first decade of this century, let's say 2008, 2009, something like that. And Blake picked me up from the airport, and we were driving to campus. He lived near Stanford even then. He's passed away now. And we were talking, and he said, it's funny because there's a couple of wars going on right now. We have this war in Afghanistan and this war in Iraq. And if you look around, it's like nothing is going on. American troops are fighting, there's wars happening in these countries, but around you, there's nothing. You go on the Stanford campus, you give your lecture, it's not affecting anybody. There's no protest, there's no nothing. And he was sort of baffled and horrified by this state of affairs. And I really thought a lot about that, and I've thought about it many times since. I think that, America has wound up doing enormous harm to itself. If we talk about where, America could go, what might be this optimistic future. And I think that, in a sense, what you see now is large swaths of the country which disproportionately provided the troops that went to fight in these wars, that have proven catastrophic for the countries in which these wars were fought, but also catastrophic for the families of these young people who went and fought in them, for the United States, are now reeling with a sense of betrayal, a sense of disenchantment with what the United States is. And I think that that something quite profound has been happening in the United States. You know, if you compare the current generation of Americans to those who were mobilized to fight the Second World War, where basically everybody was sent. America has found a way to numb itself to foreign policy in a way. Wars can be fought, America can do things, and people can be somewhat insulated from the consequences. I think that has resulted in America making a series of very, very bad decisions. And if I were to imagine what would be a more positive future for the United States, I would think that, you know, America needs to look inward, actually. It is not clear to me that America's interventions around the world are particularly helpful or useful. I think that American society is deeply divided. American people are grappling with all sorts of problems. You know, I went to a public school in California in the 1970s, and when I went to Pakistan and arrived in Lahore and went to one of the best schools in Lahore, my free public school California education was so much better than the best education on offer in Lahore. It's not like that today. And so I think, in a sense, I would imagine a future American engagement, an optimistic engagement, would be one where America did much, much less in the world. It did it with enormously more humility, focused much more on the United States. And people say, well, okay, this is sort of isolationism, etc. It needn't be isolationism. But I suppose my take on all this is informed by, when you're in Pakistan, Pakistan was a US treaty ally for much of the Cold War. Almost every dictator in Pakistani history has been the recipient of massive amounts of US aid. We in Pakistan were America's ally in the successful fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And what is the legacy of that fight? The legacy of that fight was the transformation of Pakistani society under the Islamizing dictator Zia-ul Haq into this horrifiedly disfigured society. And the utter devastation of Afghanistan, which continues to this day. And you can say, oh, well, the Soviets were defeated, the Cold War was won, it was a great intervention. It wasn't actually a great intervention. So I tend to think that in many ways, the optimistic vision for the United States is in fact a United States that comes to recognize that its power to shape the world for good is quite limited. Not nothing, but more limited than people would sometimes have us believe. And to the extent that that power exists, it is fundamentally premised on an America that is good for Americans.
So let's stay there for a second, Mohsin. If I could ask Ben, and I think, Ben, I mentioned President 45. You worked for 44, excuse me. Sorry. I take that back.
That'd be a plot twist right there, Lenny. Yeah.
Sorry about that. My fault. But Ben, I'm wondering, for someone who worked in an administration like President Barack Obama's, that was known, at least in part, for having a more restrained sense of the role of the US in the world. And it seemed that the kind of hubris on steroids under the Obama administration had been tamped down. In the Biden administration, however, the idea once again of communities of democracy, this kind of polarity of democracy versus autocracy, a kind of gladiatorial fight to the finish, has once again been restored. Do you feel in an optimistic way that a subsequent administration will take on what Mohsin is saying, a recognition that America may be a declining power, and what that means for the world, and that the kind of somewhat limiting polarity of democracy versus autocracy may itself be rethought. Can you imagine that optimistically?
I can try. And I just want to validate what a great idea this all is, because as Ece alludes to, as someone who often is at the security conferences, I'd much rather be with this collection of people. I feel like I've been promoted, But because actually, when I left government, I think the first thing I read was Ece's book about how to lose a country. And I think one thing Americans lack, and it relates to your question, Lenny, is if you look at America from the outside in, it's much clearer than the view from the eye of the storm here in Washington. I could understand what happened to our democracy from reading Ece's book about what happened in Turkey, because it's like being in a dysfunctional family. Sometimes you have to step outside of your family and look at it from the outside in, not that any of us have experience with that. And to get to your question, nobody believes the version of the United States that our own national security policy is wired to do, other than the people who are running the machine. Whether they're in government or whether they're here in DC or even if they're Europeans who are kind of plug into the American security state, nobody else believes that kind of virtuous hegemonic capacity to shape events exists anymore. Never mind that it's a positive force. And there's also an insecurity in, as someone who cares about small d democracy, there's an insecurity in thinking that you have to try to impose that on somebody. If you had a confidence in your society and you had the confidence of the guy that shows up in Turkey and just thinks that, the best thing I can do as an American is talk to people about how to ask questions, you wouldn't need to fight a perpetual war in multiple countries on behalf of that. You wouldn't need to arm like a collection of autocratic or autocratic-light partners to preserve some so-called liberal international order that does not exist anymore. So I think that the first point I'd make is, as I guess the person here who's meant to represent the U.S.
You say, Ben, quickly, the liberal international order doesn't exist anymore. It existed before and doesn't exist now?
There were a set of institutions and norms that I think were quite important, right? And that either facilitated collective action, but also just, even though nobody ever really lived up to the norms, there was at least some magnetic accountability around the pretending, And I think what we're living in is a world that has reverted back to nationalism being the guiding force for politics inside of countries and between countries. And when that's the case, how can you say there's a rules-based international order when you're giving unconditional military assistance to Israel to bombard Gaza? It's a selective menu. It's a rules-based international order when we want to use that order to, sanction Russia, but it's not a rules-based order in Gaza. It's not a rules-based order when we are trying to figure out how to create supply chains of critical minerals that will facilitate the American, battery industry, right? And so this is not to say, this is leading to the answer to your question, though, Lenny, which is, what is the role of government in this kind of world in which we can't pretend anymore that the U.S. can control events, can dictate outcomes, can exert, to your initial statement, pressure from A on B and something happens, right? While the U.S. still has a tremendous amount of power. I think that we have to kind of return to a view of the government's role is to prevent the worst outcomes. The best thing that could happen in the next administration is that we don't have World War III, is that the current conflagration with a war in Eastern Europe, a war in the Middle East, war across North Africa, that doesn't spread to Asia, and that there's some de-escalation where that war exists. Which, by the way, is not a novel idea. I think job one in the Cold War was usually preventing World War III. In fact, the international order was built expressly to prevent another world war. And so it's changing the paradigm from, instead of us, the goal of American foreign policy is inherently expansionist. It's to win a battle with somebody else. It's to defeat, Vladimir Putin entirely, and this is not, I have no sympathy whatsoever for Putin, but the point is that I think the role of the three things that Tom introduced are the things that I think about, which are potential for global war, climate change, and artificial intelligence, and the uses of technology. And to me, the best case outcome is that you have a government that is at a minimum trying to avoid that global conflagration, which will require greater dialogue, particularly with China, and ultimately some view of Ukraine that manages to support the Ukrainians without fighting to the last one in a proposition that is not going to achieve maximalist aims.
So Ben, if I may, if we take China, we take AI, we take pandemic, we take inequality, we take all these issues of civilizational consequence that have to be dealt with today, not tomorrow. Right? It's a very different sense of the politics of time. We need to deal with these things today. And the problem with democracy is that democracy is about uncertainty. We have to be certain if we're going to come to grips with these challenges. So I wonder, Veronica is a person who has now endured several months of a new reactionary president in your country, Javier Milei, who seems to be another in a long litany of reactionaries globally. Whether we think about Putin, Xi, Netanyahu, Viktor Orban, the list is long and the list is regrettable. But the question I wonder, Veronica, is that we can't ignore, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. And I say that only because we can't necessarily decide whom we want to be our elected officials. Can we get things done with a Javier Milei? Can the US work in a sort of thoughtful and concerted way with Xi Jinping to be able to contend and confront with the issues Ben was mentioning? Or are we simply waiting it out 4 years? Or 5 years or 6 years until the next person may come in who will be of a different stripe. Can you work with a Javier Milei? Can you work with a Xi Jinping?
With Javier Milei, no. I hope no. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I think he is a fascist, so I don't think that we can try to work with fascism. Nowadays in Argentina, we are in a terrible situation. And for example, Javier Milei is saying that he will defund and close public universities, for example. And he's accusing the people like me who works in the university that we are doing a sort of indoctrination in Marxism. So this kind of very aggressive politics are nowadays like in a very destructive line of policies. So I don't know if Milei will last the 4 years, because Argentina is a very powerful country in terms of political tradition of uprising, social movements, union organizations. So we have this paradoxical situation nowadays. He won the elections, but like 2 weeks after he took office, the protests started, and nowadays there are all the time protests. We are organizing different strikes and different meetings and assemblies. So I don't know if he will last. And Yes, I want to add that, for example, he is not a nationalist right-wing leader. He assumes a sort of what we call internal colonialism. He is completely fascinated with the United States. He is expecting that Trump win the elections, and he is completely fascinated with the Israel genocidal politics. So for me, it's very difficult to think in a sort of negotiation with that kind of politics.
So if Donald Trump is re-elected, President of the United States, Ece, do you think that it is incumbent upon Americans, incumbent upon American policymakers, incumbent upon people in the opposition to figure out ways in which Donald J. Trump can be supported to have more thoughtful, more sympathetic, and more reasonable policies? Because from what Veronica is saying with Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, nothing's possible. He's a fascist, and thereby the idea of breaking bread in any way is off the table. Now, the current administration in power in the United States has in many ways foreclosed the possibility of working in a reasonable fashion with the People's Republic of China. Is that a thoughtful way of handling in a future US administration looking past 2024 foreign policy? Can you demonize countries, or do you need to figure out how to work with autocracy?
Always the hardest questions, I end up with them. Ben mentioned how to lose a country. There's this quote that Argentinians love these days. I keep seeing it on social media. I said something like, I wrote something like, debating with a right-wing populist is like playing chess. Even if you are great at chess, they scatter the pieces, shit on the board, and then fly away proudly. So, but then this is the funny part. The not so funny part is I have to go deep down on what you mean by democracy, unfortunately, when I speak about these issues. Democracy is such an interesting word nowadays. Netanyahu uses it to kill Palestinian people and to get the aid from the United States, which happened on Saturday. And anyway, so we have to think about, in coming days, I think we're going to do that. What do we understand from democracy, and how has it become such a caricature of itself, and so on. But then you're right. When these guys, such men like Modi in India or Erdogan in Turkey, Trump in the United States, when they come to power, there's this habit of equalizing their people with the dictator, which is at best ignorant, but then actually it's quite selfish to do. And that's because there has been cultural boycotts to Israel, Russia, and so on and so forth. Coming from Turkey, I know that as a people, it feels absolutely unfair to be equated with your dictator. Whenever I'm on a stage, by the way, they kind of put this Erdogan picture behind me, and he's always bigger than me. New York Times publishes a long interview with me, and then I end up like this, and then Erdogan is like massive. And this actually represents a mindset, like how important it is to be powerful, and giving power, reproducing that power, actually by amplifying the picture of these dictators and equating them with their people. America, I mean, like Veronica, of course, put it more eloquently. America, so funny. You look like Captain America now, and we're talking America. It's big. That's a very big word to talk about. But America can be more enthusiastic, let's say, when working with the people of these countries, for the people of these countries, as enthusiastic as they support the dictators before they become dictators. Erdogan, as Ben would remember very well, has been shown as the exemplary leader for Middle East. He represented the perfect combination of Islam and democracy for a long time before, and he was already showing dictatorial attitudes. And this goes for Argentina as well. I mean, like, I hope same enthusiasm can be shown in supporting people of Argentina, that it, you know, the same enthusiasm as supporting the president, the new chainsaw guy. So that enthusiasm that created, actually, not created, but like supported the creation process of dictators, can be replaced with enthusiasm of, you know, supporting actually genuinely progressive people who are really working for democracy despite all the pressure, all the oppression. So I wanted to reverse the question.
No, fair. Fair.
Yeah?
We have 5 minutes to questions and answers, and I should have said before that there are people collecting questions. So write your questions down and hand them over so we can begin those in just 5 minutes. But Ece mentioned, Mohsin, Narendra Modi, who, as we know, over the next 6 weeks, there's a national election in India. President Joseph Biden gave Narendra Modi the biggest, most elaborate state dinner in American history. Does that send, for those who feel that Narendra Modi is taking India into a sort of regrettable trajectory with sort of deeply chauvinistic, xenophobic forms of Hindutva, does the United States, in celebrating him, is that an error that hopefully will not be reproduced in subsequent administrations, or is it simply geopolitics? China's there, therefore India has to be treated differently?
I think it's an example of this recurring pattern. Ben mentioned this whole idea of this international order not really existing. And I would agree. I think that in a sense, we had this moment, from the fall of the Berlin Wall until sometime a decade ago, a few years ago, which was this moment where America exerted enormous power. But even then, it wasn't, a unified order. But it's receding. And now I think, unfortunately, what we're dealing with is in America's, or I should say in the American foreign policy establishment's desire to retain primacy, a sense of primacy in the world. America is engaged in a series of actions that are hugely counterproductive for the United States and hugely counterproductive for the world. The idea of, embracing Narendra Modi so closely is, of course, because India is the only country big enough, next to China, to sort of counterbalance the Chinese threat. But there's a question that should come before that, how big a threat is China? China as a threat to whom? What are we even talking about? It seems quite clear that we will not, as humanity, be able to address the incredible challenges we face unless countries like the United States and China work together. And at a very basic level, how are we going to deal with climate change, and how are we going to deal with the rise of AI? How are we going to deal with all of this stuff? We really don't have the luxury of entering into this kind of a conflict. And so, again, I revert to my own Pakistani experience, the same way that Ziaul Haq, who Islamized Pakistan, who eviscerated so much of Pakistani civil society and bequeathed to us a demeaned, political, social environment, was the favorite dictator of the United States in the 1980s. Modi is that now. In the same way that Pakistani society was transformed in the 80s, India society is being transformed that way now. You would think that India would look over at Pakistan and think, this is not really a model we should be pursuing. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And so I think it is worth, since we're sitting in the United States, stopping and asking the question, why are we doing this? what is this position that we are trying to defend? And the truth is, we actually have no idea. The world is a confusing place.
So is it going to be confusing? And I'd like to just ask Ben before we move to questions. For a Donald Trump administration, Ben, can you give 1, 2 more aspects of a Donald Trump foreign policy that you feel would be beneficial for the relationship between the US and the world?
I mean, the thing about Trump that's interesting is he has given voice to, I think, certain critiques of American foreign policy that are not taken seriously because of the form in which they're presented, but are useful, you know, in the sense that, and you know, I think it's entirely appropriate to focus on a lot of the Trump base. Some of them are people that fought in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of them, though, are people that were fed a steady diet of information that victory was just on the cusp. You know, that if you watch Fox News in the Bush years, you know, the insurgency was always about to be defeated and George Bush was about to be validated. And when you're lied to like that for a very long time, you don't trust your elites anymore. And that's how the Republican Party went from George W. Bush to Donald Trump, is those people stopped believing what they were told. Now, I think Trump's correctives are the wrong ones, though, because they kind of revert to this transactionalism that makes it very hard to solve problems. So, you know, while there's some utility in the critique that Trump gives some expression to of globalization and American foreign policy, his answers are to kind of just tear things up and then try to, pursue a transactional approach. I do think, to draw on something Ece said, and to your point, Lenny, about just quickly on climate and AI, like, relations are not just between the leaders, though. This is so important. Like, AI is about what American technology companies are doing and what American academics are doing and what the civil society that got smarter about tech because of social media is now looking for. And so the guardrails that have to be built up around AI, yes, I think ideally would involve the US and China getting together instead of just seeing this as a domain of competition to figure out everything from how to prevent worst case outcomes related to AI to how to not turn the whole world into two competing supply chains around AI and clean energy. Climate change is an incredibly multifaceted structure that involves everybody from activists to asset managers to governments, right? And so I think part of what Trump has forced us to do by being such an irresponsible actor is he's forced us to see that we're not just leaders. We don't just sit back passively and wait for a heroic president or prime minister to solve problems. And to kind of regain that confidence that, you know, frankly, the great success in Washington's conception of itself, the victory in the Cold War, was not because, like, Ronald Reagan increased the defense budget in the 80s or sent some surface-to-air missiles to Afghanistan. It's because more people on the other side of the wall wanted to live like the people on the west side of the wall, you know? And so I think what Trump forces us to do that is constructive is to see our own agency in trying to solve these problems. And yes, ideally, the US and the PRC would be, at a government-to-government level, participating constructively in that. Trump kind of accelerates the degree to which the rest of us have to take more agency if he's back in there.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, for that. We're going to move to questions. Verónica, as our activist scholar, this may be useful for you, but for anyone, please, to chime in. So the first question from one of our students here is: a majority of Americans, especially young people, currently oppose US foreign policy on Gaza, but it remains unchanged. How could we make our foreign policy making process more democratic?
Well, I think that it's very important, this politics from below, to change also foreign policy and to open up spaces of change. For example, I want to make an example. A couple of weeks ago, Milei was here with Elon Musk. And the part of the conversation was about the concern of Elon Musk about the degrowth of population and the threat of abortion politics as a threat of civilization. So we can see how our struggle for abortion rights is nowadays confronted and part of the patriarchal reaction that we see as a vector of foreign policy for the ultra-right wing. So I truly believe in the capacity of struggles from below to open up spaces of liberation with an impact in foreign policy. I think it's not disconnected. So what is happening here in the campus, in different universities, I think it's very important for the world also to see that US is not only the powers that we know, that is an anti-colonial struggle from below, that it is a concrete basis to imagine other possibilities.
Nice. You know, for those of you who don't know, Verónica was part of and a leader of the feminist movement in Argentina that got abortion legalized, and reproductive health and reproductive rights. So while the United States has overturned its reproductive rights constitutional provisions, in Argentina, thanks to people like Verónica, in places like Mexico, Ireland, all Catholic countries, by the way, reproductive rights is now the law of the land. Thank you for what you said, Verónica. I'm wondering, Mohsin, if you have as much faith in the people as Verónica does, because the next question says, how can young people advocate for a better future and help build stronger democracies? Because often people say that young people don't care about foreign policy, foreign policy is not part of elections. It seems as if this election, maybe for the first time in any dramatic way, foreign policy will matter.
Well, it mattered in 1968, the last time there was a Democratic convention in Chicago, and young people were pretty active. And with interesting results in that, we had the Nixon presidency and we had actually the end of the Vietnam War on that watch. We'll see what happens if there's any parallels to what's happening this year. But, for young people have to grapple with the fact that in the West, in countries like the United States, society is structured in a way that it has never been structured before. It is structured due to the decline in the birth rate. The number of old people or older people my age and older, as a share of the population of the countries of the West, is much bigger than it has ever been in human history. And the share of young people is much smaller. Now, this has the effect in democracies, alongside the fact that young people vote less, of severely disempowering young people and privileging policies that help the old, piling up massive debt that you won't be around to have paid off, not being concerned with the climate crisis because who cares, you're old, not investing in schools. Your time has passed to do that. Now, this is a very pernicious thing because I think that society's changed less because we as individuals become somehow more wise and more able to realize that this person is equal to us. And the way the society has changed, my sense is people go old and die. And young people grow up with different points of view. And over the decades, over the generations, countries hopefully become more inclusive, more tolerant, more democratic, not necessarily, but it's a process of generational shift. Now, in the West, including the United States, that process is now stuck. There are just not enough young people. There are too many, in a historical sense, older people. Now, what are young people to do? They don't have the capacity to shape their society's politics, perhaps in the way that the people of the 1960s did when they were young, when the baby boomers were a much bigger share of the US population than young people are today. But it doesn't mean, of course, that all is lost. It means that young people have to reckon with the fact that they can't count on numbers to make their point. They will have to be much more active. In a sense, young people will need to do much more work to influence the policies of their countries than people had to do, perhaps, before. And so for young people in the United States, I think what we're beginning to see, for example, with the Gaza protests, but perhaps in other areas as well, is the realization that much more will need to be done to affect any change. And if you look at the US presidential candidates, people are astounded that these two old people, that nobody seems to much want, are running for president. It shouldn't be surprising. It is the natural product of a society that has grown, demographically speaking, old. And the young are going to need to figure out ways in which they can infuse their views, their values, their ownership of a future that they will hopefully live to actually see into American political discourse. And they have to take that on.
So Mohsin, just to take the case of Gaza, because Ece mentioned a little bit ago the convulsive demonstrations happening on the campus of Columbia University in Morningside Heights in New York. Imagine things are happening here too. We haven't yet witnessed, but it's happening on a lot of campuses. Why is it that a occupation that is now many decades old, why has it reached for young people such a point of profound concern, where people are willing to take steps that they had not in most other instances for this particular political moment? And what are the implications of that for the US, you think?
Well, first of all, there is a genocide going on that's already massive. Right or wrong, I think humans are doomed to understand what the difference between right and wrong when it's shown in the contrast of black and white historic documentaries. But then now it is so blatantly unfair, unjust, and devastating, inhuman what's happening to Gaza, in Gaza. I think it's impossible not to see it. Inhumaneness of it. But more importantly, Mohsin is right. Young generation don't know what we know. Actually, now I'm thinking, we were talking earlier, our dictators were great friends. No, seriously. That's why I know Pakistani songs. Zia-ul Haq and Kenan Evren in 1980s, both good friends of then US government. They were amazing. They were celebrating each other's birthday by sending kid choruses to each other. And that's why I know Jive, Jive, Jive Pakistan song. Why am I telling this? Because we know how things can get ugly. What dictators can do, what is lack of democracy is, what torture is, like actual physical torture is, and how leftists are killed and tortured, exiled and oppressed and so on and so forth by fascism. But new generation, I think they still have this notion of justice in them. So they are acting upon it. Of course, there's social media. They are literally talking to each other with the young people in Gaza right now. So that makes sense. That makes an impact. They listen to stories, they see the faces, and Gaza is not this place, in the rest of the world, in the wilderness and so on. They see the people. So social media, I think, is one of the factors. But then, as Nesreen was saying this morning, we are coming to the edge of history. There is this feeling of we're approaching to the edge of history. Something is going to shift and shift very dramatically. These things, like, movements, they don't necessarily change things. They don't necessarily shape foreign policy, let's say. But they make some things morally impossible to do. You know, Occupy movement, Argentina, and you know, feminism in Argentina, or you know, right now Colombia is happening, this Gaza. It doesn't necessarily change the decision of decision makers, but it makes it so embarrassing to take these decisions. It paralyzes the political system. So it actually shapes the political narrative, but not necessarily in a very direct way. So that's why we have to keep our faith in political movements. Not that necessarily they overnight you wake up to another world, but it gradually changes everything. And one day you wake up and, like in Black Lives Matter, for instance, you wake up and you know, doing that racist thing that you did one day ago becomes impossible.
So there's a question here specifically for Ben, but I wonder, Ben, if I could beg your indulgence, and please be open and say, I shall not answer the question, but if Barack Obama were in power today as president, would he, in a counterfactual way, have handled the Gaza situation differently?
I don't want to take the easy way out and say, of course he would have, you know, because it's a counterfactual. I guess I will say, he did not get along with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that was no secret. And so I do think that at the outset, post-October 7th, I'm not sure that he would have as fully and comprehensively embraced Netanyahu, and probably would have been a bit quicker to be vocal in being willing to differ with the Israeli government. I mean, this was a difference that was evident at the time in the Obama administration. You know, there was a kind of segment of people that had a view that Biden himself articulated. So this is not me putting words in his mouth. That the way that you embrace Israel and you keep any disagreement private, and that embrace is what allows you to do certain things. I think that the lesson I learned is that, you know, where we did have differences that we followed all the way to logical conclusion with Netanyahu was on the Iran agreement, right? And then part of what we were able to demonstrate is it's okay to just disagree. And if Netanyahu is going to fly to Washington and give a speech to the U.S. Congress opposing our foreign policy, we're willing to live with that. You know, like, you have to be willing to accept, and this is what I've seen the administration has struggled with, is they want to be seen to be evolving to a more critical place, but they don't want to be seen to just be, you know what, we totally disagree here. You're doing the wrong thing. And you can't, there's no threading the needle here, you know. You're either fundamentally supportive of Israeli government policy, or you're taking clear steps to pursue a different policy. I'd like to think that, you know, we would have, you know, made that kind of more definitive break. I can't say for certain. I will say that it actually relates to young people, because nobody brings them into these conversations. And Lenny, when we were, when the Iran deal was reached in the summer of 2015, for instance, AIPAC announced that they were going to spend, I think, $40 million to defeat it, and they, you know, mobilized a lot of infrastructure to pressure Democratic members of Congress, and they could have killed the deal, like if they had gotten a few Democratic votes. And one of the things that we did is we turned to the broader progressive infrastructure, like Move On and actually probably a bunch of Open Society Foundation partners, and we said, okay, when these members of Congress go back, here's actually, you know, here are the arguments that, you know, you can bring to town halls. And And I actually think that, one of the things, Obama didn't do everything right by any stretch of the imagination, but he did try to enlist young people, in 2008, for instance, that whole campaign was predicated on basically we're going to have thousands of young field organizers in their 20s who are going to knock on doors and, by the way, also try to convince their parents. And nobody asks young people to do anything anymore in politics, other than vote at the very end, And young people are onto that, Like, you can't just ignore me and then show up in the summer and tell me, well, you better vote for me because this other guy, he's much worse. That politics doesn't work anymore. And so I think if you truly want to thread these questions together, a lot of politics is designed to make young people either cynical or apathetic, right? Cynical, nothing matters. Apathetic, it's not worth trying, And therefore, the tremendous reservoir of energy that young people have, which I now appreciate as I enter middle age, they have tremendous agency. They are the cultural shapers of society. They are the people, again, with the most energy and time to get out and be politically active. They are the target consumers for the corporations that are doing so well in the society. There's a lot of effort made to make young people feel like that energy is disconnected from politics. Focus it on your consumption, focus it on your social media, focus it on anything but political outcomes. And frankly, whether that's young people themselves or more, I think, positively inclined politicians need to try to kind of have more connectivity. Even what's happening with the protest movement, it needs to plug into some organized politics. The way things will change is if the number of Democrats that voted against that assistance package was higher. And that's not to say everything has to be an inside game. It doesn't. You need protest, you need activism, you need cultural narrative, you need all of it. But you also have to be aware of the fact that the system is designed to tell you we have no alternative but to fully support this Israeli military operation.
So it is possible because,
yeah.
Outside Washington, from where I come from, or in Europe as well, there is this myth of Washington, and it's impossible to disagree with Israel.
Yeah, well, I should say, so I, at risk to any future career in politics, took on the spokesmanship of the Iran nuclear deal, which, Donald Trump tore up and Joe Biden would go back into. So I don't know, you can take both lessons from the experience of the Iran nuclear agreement, right? It is possible.
I would say,
but it's also very hard, and it's hard to make it stick.
Yes, it was an extraordinary achievement of the Obama administration to get that JCPOA deal. And for those of you who don't know, the person who worked also with Ben and others on that deal is now suspended from the State Department. Yeah. Hasn't been told why. His name's Rob Malley, why he's been suspended. But these tragedies continue to unfold. Let's hope that in a future administration, that JCPOA, Iran is one of the most profound civilizations in human history, can come back to some sort of effectuation. Ben, there was a question here, but I'd like to, because we have around 8 minutes, anyone to please chime in. It says that Ben brought up that nationalism is now the guiding principle in domestic and international policy rather than the liberal international order. Is there a scenario where nationalism can be harnessed for good? Can nationalism be productive, and can it be useful? And if not, how do we diffuse it?
I don't know. I was saying that Milei is not a nationalist. He resigns all kind of sovereignty, for example, in terms of currency. He wants to dollarize the Argentinian economy. And also he is, very committed with the extractivist policies around the so-called lithium triangle with Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So he's a person who wants to get rid of any sense of sovereignty. So that was the idea of internal colonialism that I was quoting before, because, for example, it's a difference between him and Bolsonaro, for example, in Brazil, who embrace a very nationalist sense of governance. So I think that this is a very particular feature of Milei that is very interesting also to analyze the geopolitical moment.
But Mohsin, if you think about nationalism in a very analytical way as making nation and state congruent, so supporting Kurdish nationalism or Palestinian nationalism or what have you, is just about allowing one to have their self-conscious cultural community have sovereignty. Is that not an unproblematic thing and something we should all get behind?
I mean, it gets very complicated very fast, and the problem is that we live among each other. And so the Kurds live with the Arabs, and the Punjabis live with the Pathans, and blue states and red states, and we have all these different people who are sort of mixed together. There are pros and cons in nationalism. I don't want to get in too much detail with it, but if we look at nationalism, for example, in the United States, there's certainly a very virulent kind of anti-migrant nationalism. But also there's a nationalism which might ask the question, why is it that the prime minister of a foreign country can come to the United States and address Congress on a matter of national security and be treated with such reverence and respect? It's an utterly shocking state of affairs. I think outside the world, people watch this and think, this is the United States, the superpower. This is a small country that receives large amounts of US aid. How is it possible that this can go on? So to a certain extent, if nationalism meant to say, what the hell are we doing? And let's wake up, one could see a positive side to it. But the last thing I want to say is, nationalism is one of many types of narratives that we have to bind disparate groups of people together. There's also religious discourse. We are all Muslims, or we are all Christians, or we are all Jews. I think we are reaching a state in a very interconnected humanity where we need to come up with other convincing narratives that allow us to begin to work together as human beings. And the narrative that has been tried, which is, it's all free markets and, it seems to have not worked. People aren't wedded to this idea. But I think it's dangerous to default back necessarily to nationalism or religious identity or whatever it is. And I'd be very curious to hear what others say on this, and hopefully we'll find out more this week. But part of the challenge we face now is to begin to articulate new, convincing, shared visions of the future that human beings can partake of, that are compelling to us, that lead us in this interdependent world to something better.
So is that new narrative, Ece, that Mohsin refers to cosmopolitanism? And should we all be rallying around the flag of cosmopolitanism?
Cosmopolitanism has, we spoke earlier about this. It has so many bad connotations because they belong to nowhere, and everybody is suspecting them to do something wrong and so on. These people. During the week, we're going to talk about these things, but one of the things I'm thinking about, as opposed to citizenship, is friendship. Friendship is such a profound idea that has been, written about from Spinoza to Derrida and so several other philosophers, Simone Weil and so on. It sounds naive, crazy, to think of friendship as a political connection. But then citizenship is also was a crazy idea. Let's draw lines and then let's die for these lines, and then people belong to this part of the line. On the other side, there are others. This is already a crazy idea. So friendship is less of a crazy idea when you think of it. But then how can we scale it up to create an international or let's say supranational bond between people. Several kinds of internationalism is being experimented at the moment. One of them is Veronica's internationalism, feminism and internationalism thinking together. We're going to think about these things. We will have to, because nation states are falling apart, borders are, falling apart, and it is individuals who are carrying the burden of this failure, of this grand finale of nation states. But then these individuals, be it immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker, whatever, they are going to be the ones who are going to build the new world. New worlds are not built in, on the stages. They are built in invisible corners of society, in the margins of the societies. And it is being built now, right now. Because of the immigration waves and so on and so forth. This is the first time in human history, I think, in recorded history at least, that we see such a big flux of populations. And we're going to keep seeing that a lot. So New World is already in the making. And in order to replace citizenship or such narrow and poor concepts, we're going to use everything we have. And one of them might be to think about friendship. And as I see it, friendship is the most noble attempt to ultimate justice between the people.
So I like that, Ece. We have like 30 seconds, I think. And the one word we haven't used at all in thinking about America in the future is the world of universality. Now, maybe that term is deeply suspect for reasons we can adduce, but I wonder, Ben, if even if America is a declining power, is there still something about the American ideal around universality of norms, human rights precepts, whatever, that we still should, in different ways, new animated ways, hold on to? Or do we just want to sort of let it go?
No, I think you need to, in the sense that part of what's interesting about America is that we have people from all over the world, and so the world's diversity is kind of encompassed within our own borders. I think the idea, the kind of utopian post-World War II universality of a common set of rights and norms that everybody agrees to seems further away. But to just tie it to that national question really quickly, space is an interesting example from the past, where nationalism was harnessed around the space race, right? And that could have gone worse in the sense that you could have had the total militarization of space. And part of what happened is you had Russian and American nationalism and then other countries coming in. And then ultimately there was a development of a shared internationalization of space. I only mention that because right now the world order is kind of broken apart, and you've got kind of the real national, China, Xi, Modi, Putin, Trump, and to some extent Biden. These are nationalists and the big powers. And to me the question is, can you thread together a world in which the pursuit of new clean energy technologies or new AI is not a zero-sum competition, but is something that can lead to a threading together of like the next version of an international order. And if there has to be some idea of universality, even if it's just the universal aspiration to not have global war, or the universal aspiration to not have an AI that can destroy humanity, basic, universality around pandemic preparedness. It's not simply about political dictates and rights. I think those are important. It's basically about the acceptance that we all actually are going to keep having to live here. None of us are going anywhere. And if we can avoid, the reason I started with worst case outcomes is actually I'm quite optimistic if we can avoid those. That Ece is right, that there's some more interesting world that is being generated. We just kind of have to get through the next 10 years to allow that to generate, right? And so that's why I really do think it's just about, the best case scenario is just getting out of the way of the kind of regeneration that is happening around us.
So I think we're going to leave things in this guardedly optimistic note. And thank Ben and Ece and Mohsin and Veronica for really extremely reflective and critical and thoughtful comments. And thank you all so much for your questions.